Cool, great. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, right. So you've seen the opening slide, but let me just give you an overview of the issue. So the aim here is to show how a certain account of the metaphysics of laws and properties can capture something of the idea that the laws are metaphysically necessary, and also something of the idea that the laws are metaphysically contingent. And I have sort of recently become slightly skeptical about sort of full-blown metaphysical realism in all domains, and so I think more and more these days that kind of reconciling different positions is a good function for metaphysics. And so then if a view can kind of help with reconciling a dispute, that kind of counts in favor of the view. I don't know if that makes me like a Hegelian or something, but we'll see. So the background, okay, great. So the idea that laws hold of metaphysical necessity has sort of gained support, I guess, roughly since Kripke. Maybe that's something that people think. And dispositional essentialism seems to be the most prominent necessitarian view, right? This is the view defended by the likes of Alexander Bird and Anjan Chakravarty, which says that laws of nature hold in virtue of the essences of properties, right? So then there's this sort of question, okay, but what about contingentist intuitions? So it's all well and good saying that the laws are metaphysically necessary, but some people really think that the laws are contingent. So what can the dispositional essentialists say to them? Well, actually, dispositional essentialism allows for something of a sort of Kripkean redescription strategy, right, which can help to capture these contingentist intuitions. So while the dispositional essentialist will say it's necessary that the charge is governed by Coulomb's law, they nonetheless kind of concede that, well, some other property, Schmarge, might be governed by Shmulom's law, which is an inverse cube law or something like that, right? So there's a sort of way that they can capture these contingentist intuitions, which maybe some would think kind of count in favor of the view. Others might think that actually it kind of means that, you know, is dispositional essentialism really necessitarian at all after all, right? So I know that Al Wilson brings up this kind of concern. Modal necessitarianism is a stronger view about the modal status of the laws, right? So it says quite simply that all laws are nomologically identical, right? So there's no Schmarge and Shmulom's law or anything like that. All laws really are exactly the same with respect to the laws of nature that prevail and the properties that are instantiated. And so there's no obvious Kripkean redescription strategy available to the modal necessitarian to kind of appease these contingentist intuitions. Okay. So that's a bit of background. So my plan really it should be quite straightforward, is just to show how a relatively niche view of the metaphysics of laws and properties can kind of both underpin modal necessitarianism, not dispositional essentialism, but modal necessitarianism in a sense, but also kind of uphold this conceivability possibility link and thereby capture this contingentist intuition. So yeah, reconcile these different intuitions about the modal status of the laws. Okay, so what's the metaphysics of properties and laws that I've got in mind? Well, it's this thing called the Powers-BSA, which I've kind of spoken about, and Demarest also is famous for developing this view, and Neil Williams in his most recent book. I also think this reconciliatory move that I'm going to kind of defend in this talk might be available to something like Al's quantum modal realism too, but maybe we could get into that in the Q&A or another time. Okay, so properties on this view. What can we say about properties? Well, properties are powers in the very minimal sense that they kind of metaphysically constrain how they're possibly distributed throughout space-time, right? That's really all I want to say about the metaphysics of properties. Really, I'm just kind of denying that properties can freely recombine. I'm saying, no, there's some sort of restrictions on how these properties can be arranged through space and time, right? I suppose if you want to sort of think about it in a bit more detail, you could say it's something about the nature of these properties kind of constrains how they're distributed. And I know some of you will have sort of opinions on what more might be able to be said there, but I think, I mean, for my purposes here, that's all I really need to say, is that there are these restrictions on how properties can possibly be recombined, and that's all I mean by properties being powers, right? So I like to think of this kind of in analogy with tessellating tiles. So the way that the tiles can cover the plane is kind of constrained by how the tiles are, as illustrated with this Escher piece. Of course, this is just an analogy, but I kind of flip between thinking actually it's a pretty good analogy, and then people sometimes stop me and say, oh no, it can't really be too similar to that, but I'm not sure. I don't know, maybe people will have thoughts about that as well. That's kind of a way of thinking about the metaphysics of properties that I'm interested in. Okay, so now on to the laws part of the picture. So Powers-BSA laws, I mean, it's a kind of a hint in the name there, right? So it's going to be something to do with the BSA, Lewis's best systems analysis. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, according to the Lewisian best systems analysis, laws are axioms and theorems of the strongest, simplest deductive systematization of information about the distribution of properties throughout space-time, right? Maybe that's a sort of unnecessarily complicated way of saying something that we're all quite familiar with. Laws kind of are an efficient way of describing what goes on in the world, according to Lewis. But importantly, for my purposes here, is the fact that the Lewisian best systems analysis just systematizes the actual world, right? Whereas what the Powers-BSA does is it's like the Lewisian BSA, but it systematizes all possible worlds. So I hope that's relatively clear, but maybe it will come a little bit clearer as I talk further. Okay, so just to maybe get you on my side a little bit, I'll briefly talk about some payoffs of this Powers-BSA view. So it turns out that the laws are metaphysically explained in terms of powerful properties, right? Because as I said, properties kind of explain their own possible distributions because they constrain how they could possibly be distributed. And because laws are descriptions of these possible distributions, it turns out that the properties explain the laws, right? So there's this kind of reductive account of laws of nature, which maybe some people will find attractive. So modality isn't eliminated on this view, so perhaps this might be a potential point of confusion. Of course, Lewis was keen to eliminate modality. That's why he had this best systems analysis type way of thinking about things. But that's not what I want to say. I want to say there's modality in the world, but it's located in the physical properties, which then explain other phenomena, including laws of nature, right? So yeah, like I said, it's a sort of somewhat reductive. You're kind of reducing laws of nature to physical properties. Something that particularly attracts me to this way of thinking about things, but which I won't really say any more about here, is that it overcomes circularity worries for Bird's version of dispositional essentialism. So classical versions of dispositional essentialism build laws of nature into the essences of properties and then say that those essences in turn explain the laws of nature. And so you get what looks like quite a tight kind of explanatory circle. On this way of thinking about things, you've still got this kind of powers ontology, which can do some quite nice explanatory work, but hopefully you avoid this kind of circularity worry, which has been gaining quite a lot of interest and traction in the literature recently. Do stop me if I can't be heard or whatever for any reason. Okay, so another payoff, so you get this kind of continuity with science, right, in virtue of the BSA component. So we might think that science is sort of in the business of articulating strong, simple generalizations, and the best systems analysis kind of respects that, right? So in other words, and actually kind of linking back up to the previous talk, the Powers-BSA incorporates a pragmatic element, right? So strength, simplicity, and perhaps other pragmatic features are constitutive of what it is to be a law of nature on this view. And as we'll see, I think this is important for the reconciliation move that I'm going to discuss now. Okay, so it's going to help my argument to understand Powers-BSA laws as real patterns in Dennett's sense. Why is that the case? Well, for these reasons, right? So I want the possibility of lossy laws. I want lots of law candidates that are all kind of on an ontological par, but only some of which get to count as laws. I want to understand laws as sort of useful tools for making sense of the blooming, buzzing confusion that bombards us with data, right? This kind of pragmatist idea from James, and Dennett discusses this as well. And the idea that BSA laws are real patterns also enjoys some independent plausibility. So I know that Alessandro Torza's got a manuscript where he defends this idea, and Wheeler as well also defends this idea. So hopefully I'm not stretching things too far to suggest that Powers-BSA laws might be understood as real patterns, right? So just to kind of, again, get clear about what's going on here, the thought is that properties are spatio-temporally distributed at worlds, right? And we can think of each like space-time point at a world as like a pixel, which either instantiates or doesn't instantiate one or more of the properties that there are, right? So you've got properties and just space-time points, and properties either do or don't instantiate, or either are or are not instantiated at space-time points. But we can also think about how properties are distributed across worlds. And my point, my claim or my hope is that we can think of laws as real patterns in the trans-world distribution of properties, right? So laws are real patterns in all possible property distributions. So I've got a drawing here which is supposed to kind of give you a sense of what I'm trying to get at. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but the idea is that you've got your different properties, your crosses, your circles and your squares. They can be distributed in different ways, and we can come up with efficient descriptions of this distribution, this sort of trans-world distribution of these properties. And maybe these things are kind of like real patterns in Dennett's sense, and so perhaps are good law candidates according to this view that I want to defend. Okay, so that's the view, right? So that's the metaphysics of laws and properties. And I'm now going to show how it can capture both necessitarian and contingentist intuitions about the modal status of laws. So necessity, so the laws are necessary because they're real patterns in all possible property distributions, right? And the space of possible property distributions is itself necessary. So this is just kind of the claim that in general facts about modal space are necessary, right? Comes from S5 modal logic, which is quite kind of plausible and attractive to many people. And the point is that laws are just encoding facts about modal space, so they turn out to be necessary. That's quite straightforward. Perhaps the more controversial part is the contingency side of things, right? So I'll talk about that now. So on this picture that I've articulated so far, this thing holds, right? So necessarily all laws are real patterns in the trans-world distribution of properties. So take any law, it's going to be a real pattern in the trans-world distribution of properties. But the real patterns in the trans-world distribution of properties that get to count as laws is going to vary on a world-by-world basis, right? So the point is that the extension of the term law is going to vary from world to world. So we're getting there, hopefully. And this is because different real patterns in the trans-world distribution of properties is going to serve the scientific interests of creatures at different worlds, right? So different creatures at different worlds are going to have their interests served differently by different real patterns in the possible property distributions. So the idea then is that you've got all these real patterns in possible property distributions, and the ones that we decide to elevate the status of laws are those that strike the best strength, simplicity, usefulness, etc. balance for us. But of course, some other scientists might have their interests better served by some different real patterns. So then they're going to elevate those things to the status of laws. So hopefully we're kind of getting there with the contingency thing, but there's more to say. So the question, why would some other scientists have their interests better served by different real patterns than those that serve the interests of scientists at the actual world? And my thought is they're going to be wired differently, right? Different cognitive kind of capacities, different perceptual capacities, different interests, that sort of thing. So then the thought is that if our cognitive wiring were different, what we call laws would be different, right? What the term laws apply to would be different, but also things would seem really different, right? So cognitive wiring in this kind of way of thinking about things looks like it's a common cause of appearances and the extension of laws. So these two things are going to kind of vary together. So when things look very different, so things look one way to us, but to other creatures, things are going to look very different because their cognitive wiring is different. And so they're going to then call some other things laws than what we like to call laws. Okay, so, I mean, just to give more of a sense of this, I found this nice quote from McCulloch, right? So thinking about sonar navigating Martians, he says, sightless Martians would not have our concept read, and it can be presumed that their sonar apparatus would equip them with analogous concepts similarly inaccessible to us. For instance, they might be able to classify surfaces on a sonar basis in ways which cut across our color and other visual classifications, and which exploit an aural phenomenology in ways that we can barely, if at all, imagine, right? So this is just getting at the idea that we can imagine really differently wired creatures that will just perceive the world in a completely different way. And so my claim is that they're going to then call different things laws, right? And so for these creatures, for the Martians, things are going to look very different, and the laws are going to be different, right? Because they're going to identify some different real patterns with laws than the patterns that we identify with laws. So that's kind of pretty much it for capturing the contingentist intuition, right? The point is that, yeah, it's possible that the laws were different, and it's possible that things seemed very different, right? But maybe we can say a little bit more. So I think this opens up a novel redescription strategy, right? So the contingentist will say something like this. I can imagine a world in which the laws are different. Conceivability entails possibility, so the laws are contingent, right? That's the kind of contingentists move. And what I'm going to say is, what you really imagine is a world in which the term laws picks out different real patterns and things seem very different to you, right? So conceivability entails possibility is kind of retained so long as what is conceived is properly described. And I think this goes quite a long way to capturing the contingentist intuition. What more could the contingentist ask for, right? That's my claim. And there's a secret objections and replies slide, but I'll leave that for now so we can have a Q&A, and maybe I'll refer to that later. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.